Darius Holloway had always believed that being smart and staying out of trouble would keep him safe, but when Officer Mallory's heavy boots echoed down the hallway that Tuesday morning, those beliefs crumbled like dust, because sometimes the system doesn't care about your honor roll status or your clean record. Sometimes it just needs a target. And today, Darius was about to discover that his arrest wasn't random chance, but a carefully orchestrated move in a game he didn't even know he was playing. A game where corrupt cops destroy innocent lives for profit, where justice is bought and sold like any other commodity, and where the only person who can save him is a father who's been dead to the world for 12 years, but very much alive in the shadows, watching, waiting, and preparing to burn down an empire of lies to save his son. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The morning started like any other at Jefferson High School. Students shuffled through the hallways, lockers slammed shut, and the usual chatter filled the air. Darius Holloway walked through it all like a ghost, his earbuds blocking out the noise around him. At 17, he had learned that keeping his head down and staying invisible was the safest way to navigate high school. His backpack hung heavy on his shoulders, filled with advanced calculus textbooks and computer programming manuals that most of his classmates wouldn't touch. Darius slipped into his first period physics class just as the bell rang. He took his usual seat in the back corner, away from the popular kids who barely acknowledged his existence. The only person who ever really saw him was Maya Thompson, his best friend since middle school. She sat 2 rows ahead, her curly hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, already taking notes before the teacher had even started talking. "All right, everyone, open your books to Chapter 12, Mrs. Henderson announced. "We're going to dive into electromagnetic radiation today." Darius pulled out his notebook, genuinely interested in the subject. Science made sense to him in a way that social situations never did. There were rules, patterns, logic. You could prove things with math and experimentation. People were much more complicated and unpredictable. About 20 minutes into the lesson, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. At first, nobody paid much attention, but the footsteps got louder, more urgent, and then they stopped right outside the classroom door. The door burst open without warning. "Darius Holloway!" A loud voice boomed across the room. Every head turned as 3 police officers filled the doorway. The one in front was a big man with a thick mustache and cold blue eyes. His nameplate read, Officer B. Mallory. Behind him stood 2 younger officers who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Darius felt his stomach drop. His hands started shaking as 25 pairs of eyes stared at him. He pulled out his earbuds slowly, his mouth suddenly dry. "That's him," Officer Mallory said, pointing directly at Darius. "Stand up, son. You're coming with us." "What's going on?" Mrs. Henderson asked, stepping forward. "Officer, surely there's been some mistake." "No mistake, ma'am," Mallory cut her off. "This young man is under arrest. Darius, get up. Now." Darius's mind raced. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd been home the night before working on a programming project for his computer science class. His mother, Renee, had made dinner. They'd watched the news together, and he'd gone to bed early. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Darius said quietly, standing up on shaky legs. "I haven't done anything." "That's what they all say," Mallory replied with a sneer. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The cold metal. Handcuffs clicked around Darius's wrists as his classmates watched in stunned silence. Maya had her phone out, partially hidden behind her textbook, recording what she could without being obvious about it. "Officer, please," Mrs. Henderson tried again. "Darius is one of our best students. He's never been in trouble. Perhaps if you could just—" "Ma'am, I need you to step back," Mallory said firmly. "This thug here is wanted for assault and robbery, real serious charges." Darius winced at the word thug. He'd heard it before, always said with the same tone, always directed at kids who looked like him. "I'm not a thug," Darius said quietly. "And I didn't assault anyone or rob anyone." "Save it for the judge, kid," Mallory laughed. "You people always got an excuse ready." The walk through the school hallways felt like the longest journey of Darius's life. Word had spread quickly, and students pressed against classroom windows to get a look. Mallory made sure to walk slowly, giving everyone a good view. "Look at this," Mallory said loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Another lost cause heading nowhere fast. Bet his mama's real proud right about now." Darius kept his eyes on the floor, his face burning with humiliation. He could hear whispers following them down the hall. "Isn't that the smart kid from AP classes? I heard he robbed a store last night. My dad always said those quiet ones are the dangerous ones." Maya slipped out of class and followed at a distance, still recording on her phone. She'd known Darius for years. If he said he didn't do something, then he didn't do it. But she also knew that wouldn't matter to everyone else. At the police station, Darius was led into a small, windowless room with concrete walls and a metal table. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everything look gray and depressing. "Sit down," Mallory ordered, pointing to a plastic chair. Darius sat down carefully, the handcuffs still tight around his wrists. "Can I call my mom? Or a lawyer?" Mallory laughed again. "Lawyer? Son, you watch too much TV. We're just going to have a little chat first, clear some things up." "But don't I have the right to—" "You got the right to sit there and answer my questions," Mallory interrupted. "Now let's start from the beginning. Where were you last night around 9:30? "At home," Darius answered honestly. "I was working on a computer program for school. My mom was there. She can tell you." "Uh-huh," Mallory said, not bothering to write anything down. "And I suppose she'll say whatever you tell her to say, right? That's how it works in your neighborhood." "That's not how it works anywhere," Darius replied, a little more forcefully. "My mom doesn't lie." "Watch your tone with me, boy," Mallory warned. "You're in enough trouble already." For the next hour, Mallory asked the same questions over and over, trying to trip Darius up or get him to contradict himself. But Darius's story never changed because it was the truth. He'd been home all evening. "Look, kid," Mallory finally said, leaning back in his chair. "We got you on video, clear as day, robbing Henderson's corner store on 5th Street. Beat up the old man pretty good, too." Darius's eyes widened. "That's impossible. I've never even been to that store. I don't know where 5th Street is." "Video doesn't lie," Mallory said with a satisfied grin. "But I'll tell you what. You confess right now, show some remorse, and maybe the judge will go easy on you. Keep lying to me, and this gets a whole lot worse. I can't confess to something I didn't do," Darius said firmly. As they prepared to book him, Darius reached up to touch the silver pendant that always hung around his neck. It was a simple piece, nothing fancy, but his father had given it to him years ago before disappearing from his life. Darius wore it every day as a reminder of the man who'd once taught him to be strong. But when his fingers reached his neck, the pendant was gone. "Looking for this?" Mallory asked, holding up the necklace. "Looks like gang jewelry to me, probably stolen just like everything else you got." "That's not gang jewelry," Darius protested. "My father gave that to me. Please. Can I have it back?" "Your father?" Mallory scoffed. "Let me guess. He's not around anymore, right? Probably locked up somewhere or just took off when things got tough. That's what they do." Mallory slipped the pendant into his pocket with a smug smile. "You'll get it back when you get out. If you get out." The booking process was a blur of fingerprints, photographs, and paperwork. Darius was officially charged with assault and armed robbery. When he asked about bail, he was told it had been denied due to the violent nature of the crime. News of the arrest spread quickly through the community. By evening, it was the lead story on the local news. Officer Mallory stood in front of the police station, his chest puffed out with pride as he addressed the cameras. "This was excellent police work by our department," Mallory said confidently. "We identified the suspect quickly and got a dangerous individual off the streets before he could hurt anyone else." The reporter, a blonde woman with too much makeup, nodded enthusiastically. "Officer Mallory, can you tell us about the victim?" "Elderly. Store owner, been serving this community for 30 years, Mallory replied. "Attacked in his own store by this young thug who thought he could get away with it. But justice doesn't sleep in this city." The news ran with the headline, "Teen Terror Nabbed by Hero Cop." They showed Darius's school photo, next to a picture of Officer Mallory in his dress uniform. The contrast was intentional and devastating, and the Holloway house. Renee sat in her living room watching the news report with tears streaming down her face. At 42, she'd worked 2 jobs for most of Darius's life to keep them afloat after his father disappeared. She cleaned office buildings at night and worked at a grocery store during the day. She was tired. Always tired. But she'd never given up on her son. "That's not my baby," she whispered to the empty room. "That's not who he is." Renee drove to the police station immediately, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. She'd gotten dressed in her best clothes, hoping that looking respectable might help somehow. "I need to see my son," she told the officer at the front desk. "Darius Holloway. He was arrested today." The officer barely looked up from his paperwork. "Visiting hours are over. Come back tomorrow." "Please," Renee begged. "I just need to see that he's okay. 5 minutes. I'm his mother." Officer Mallory appeared from around the corner, having heard the commotion. "You must be Mama," he said with mock sympathy. "Let me guess, your little angel never did nothing wrong, right?" "Sir, my son is a good kid," Renee said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He gets straight A's. He's never been in trouble. There has to be some mistake." "Lady, the only mistake here is your parenting," Mallory replied coldly. "That boy's been heading down this path his whole life. Maybe if he had a father around to teach him right from wrong, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Renee felt like she'd been slapped. "Don't you dare talk to me about my parenting. I've raised my son right. He's respectful. He's smart. He's a criminal." Mallory cut her off. "And the sooner you accept that, the better off you'll be. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got real police work to do." Meanwhile, Maya had spent the entire afternoon trying to make sense of what had happened. She knew Darius better than anyone, and she knew he was telling the truth. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. She convinced her mother to drive her to Henderson's corner store on 5th Street. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Kim, was behind the counter with a bandage on his forehead. "Excuse me, sir," Maya said politely. "I'm a student journalist working on a story about crime in the neighborhood. Could I ask you a few questions about what happened last night?" Mr. Kim looked nervous immediately. "I don't want to talk about it. Police said not to talk to reporters." "I'm not a reporter," Maya assured him. "I'm just a high school student. The boy they arrested is my friend, and I'm trying to understand what happened." "Your friend?" Mr. Kim's eyes widened with fear. "You need to leave. Now. I can't talk to you." Maya looked around the store, noticing the security cameras mounted in the corners. "Sir, do you have the video from last night? The one that shows what happened?" "Video?" Mr. Kim shook his head quickly. "No video. Cameras broken. Have been broken. For weeks." But Maya could see that the cameras had small red lights blinking, indicating they were working perfectly. Someone had gotten to Mr. Kim, and he was scared to death. The next morning brought Darius's first court appearance. He was led into the courtroom in shackles, his orange jumpsuit making him stand out among the lawyers in their dark suits. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and a few supporters including Maya and her mother. Judge Patterson, an older white man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked down at Darius with barely concealed distaste. "Young man, you're charged with assault and armed robbery. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Darius said clearly. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the state has compelling video evidence of the defendant committing this violent crime. We ask that bail continue to be denied." "Your Honor," the public defender assigned to Darius said weakly, "my client maintains his innocence and has no prior record." Judge Patterson barely considered it. "Bail remains denied. This case will proceed to trial. Next case." As Darius was led away, he scanned the courtroom one more time. His mother wasn't there. She couldn't get off work and risk losing her job. Maya gave him an encouraging nod, but he could see the worry in her eyes. What Darius didn't notice was the man sitting in the back corner of the courtroom, wearing dark sunglasses and a baseball cap. The man watched every moment of the proceedings. With intense focus, his jaw clenched tight with barely controlled anger. Officer Mallory strutted out of the courtroom like he'd just won the lottery. He stopped to talk to reporters again, basking in the attention. "Justice is being served," Mallory declared. "This dangerous individual will face the full consequences of his actions." The man in the sunglasses followed Mallory out of the courthouse, keeping his distance but never losing sight of the officer. He pulled out a small device and began taking photos, documenting Mallory's every move. Later that evening, Mallory celebrated at Murphy's bar with several other officers. He held court at a corner table, retelling the story of Darius's arrest for anyone who would listen. "You should have seen the look on his face when I cuffed him," Mallory laughed, taking a long drink from his beer. "These kids think they're untouchable until reality comes knocking." "What about the video evidence?" asked Officer Jenkins, one of the younger cops. "Clear as day," Mallory replied confidently. "Kids going away for a long time." What Mallory didn't know was that the waitress serving their table, a college student named Ashley, was listening to every word. She'd grown up in the same neighborhood as Darius and knew his reputation as a quiet, studious kid. Something about Mallory's boastful attitude didn't sit right with her. When her shift ended, Ashley called Maya, whom she knew from community events. "Maya, this is Ashley from Murphy's bar. I think you need to hear what that cop said about your friend tonight." The news about Officer Mallory's celebratory boasts at Murphy's bar reached Maya early the next morning, but it would be several more days before it mattered in any official capacity. By then, Darius had been assigned a public defender who actually cared about doing her job right. Sandra Ellis had been working as a public defender for 8 years, and she'd seen enough cases to know when something stank. At 34, she was tough, experienced, and had developed a sixth sense for police misconduct. When she first read through Darius Holloway's file, every instinct she'd developed told her this case was wrong from top to bottom. Sandra's first visit to see Darius at the county jail took place on a gray Thursday morning. The visiting room was depressing. Plastic chairs, concrete walls, and the constant sound of buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. When Darius walked in wearing his orange jumpsuit, Sandra was struck by how young he looked. "Hello, Darius," she said as he sat down. Across from her, "I'm Sandra Ellis, your attorney. I know this is scary, but I want you to know that I believe you when you say you didn't do this." Darius looked up in surprise. "You do?" "I've been doing this job for a long time," Sandra replied. "I can usually tell the difference between guilty kids trying to get out of trouble and innocent kids who got caught up in something they had nothing to do with. You're the second kind." For the first time since his arrest, Darius felt a spark of hope. "So what do we do now?" "First, I need you to tell me everything that happened, from the beginning. Don't leave out any details, even if they seem unimportant." Darius told her about his normal day at school, coming home to work on his programming project, eating dinner with his mother, and going to bed early. He told her about the arrest, the interrogation, and how Officer Mallory had taken his father's pendant. "Tell me about your father," Sandra said gently. Darius hesitated. "He left when I was 5. My mom doesn't like to talk about it much. He was in the military, I think, but I don't really know what happened to him." "Do you remember anything else about him?" "He used to tell me to observe everything," Darius said quietly. "He said that if you pay attention to details, you can figure out the truth even when people are lying to you." Sandra made a note. Good advice, she thought. "Darius, I need to ask you something difficult. Has Officer Mallory or anyone else threatened you, or tried to make you confess to something you didn't do?" "Officer Mallory kept saying I should confess and that things would go easier for me," Darius replied. "But I can't confess to something I didn't do. That's not who I am." As Sandra left the jail, she felt more determined than ever to fight this case. But she also knew she was up against more than just one corrupt cop. The system had a way of protecting its own, and challenging it would require more evidence than she currently had. Her first stop was the police station, where she requested copies of all reports and evidence related to Darius's case. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with graying hair, looked at her request with obvious annoyance. "This is going to take a while," he said. "We're backed up with paperwork. "I'll wait," Sandra replied firmly. When the files finally arrived, Sandra noticed immediately that they were incomplete. The video evidence that Officer Mallory claimed was clear as day was nowhere to be found. When she asked about it, she was told it was being processed and would be available later. That evening, Sandra went back to her office and began digging deeper into Officer Mallory's history. What she found made her stomach turn. Over the past 5 years, Mallory had been involved in at least 12 arrests of minority teenagers. In every single case, the charges were serious, the evidence was questionable, and the complaints against Mallory had been dismissed or mysteriously lost. One case in particular caught her attention. 2 years ago, a 16-year-old named Marcus Johnson had been arrested for drug possession. Marcus claimed the drugs had been planted, and his family had filed a complaint against Mallory. The complaint had been sealed after Marcus pled guilty to a lesser charge. But Sandra noticed something interesting. Marcus's case had been handled by the same prosecutor who was now handling Darius's case. Sandra decided to pay Marcus a visit. She found him working at an auto repair shop on the south side of town. When she explained who she was and why she was there, Marcus immediately got nervous. "I can't talk about that," Marcus said, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "I got a record now. I can't afford any more trouble." "Marcus, I think the same thing that happened to you is happening to another kid right now," Sandra explained. "A 17-year-old named Darius Holloway." Marcus's expression changed. "The kid from Jefferson High? I heard about that on the news. If you know something that could help him, please. He's innocent just like you were." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Officer Mallory stopped me for walking while black, basically. Said I looked suspicious. He searched me, didn't find nothing, then went back to his car. When he came back, suddenly I had a baggie of cocaine in my pocket that wasn't there before." "Did you tell anyone?" "I tried. But who's gonna believe a black kid from the projects over a white cop with commendations? My lawyer said I should take a plea deal, so I did. Figured it was better than risking years in prison." Sandra thanked Marcus and gave him her card. "If you change your mind and decide you want to help, call me." Meanwhile, Maya was conducting her own investigation. She'd been thinking about Mr. Kim's obvious fear at the corner store, and she had an idea. If the security cameras were really working, maybe the footage still existed somewhere. Maya's mother worked as a freelance journalist, which meant she had contacts throughout the city. Maya convinced her to make some calls and see if anyone knew anything about the corner store robbery. "Baby, you need to be careful," her mother warned. "If this police officer is as corrupt as you think he is, he's not going to take kindly to a teenager trying to expose him." "Mom, Darius is my best friend," Maya replied. "If someone was trying to frame you for something you didn't do, wouldn't you want your friends to help?" Maya's mother sighed, knowing her daughter had inherited her stubborn streak. "Okay, but we do this the right way. No breaking into places, no dangerous stunts. We investigate like real journalists." Their first break came from an unexpected source. Maya's mother had a contact at the city's IT department who mentioned that all security camera footage from businesses in that area was automatically backed up to a central server for insurance purposes. The footage would be there unless someone had specifically ordered it deleted. But here's the weird thing, the IT contact said. Someone did put in a deletion request for that specific store on that specific night. That almost never happens unless there's an ongoing investigation. Maya and her mother exchanged glances. Someone had definitely tried to cover up what really happened at Henderson's corner store. Back at the jail, Darius was struggling to maintain hope. The other inmates mostly left him alone, but the guards treated him like he was already convicted. He spent his days reading books from the prison library and thinking about what his father might do in this situation. "Observe everything," his father had always said. So Darius started paying attention to the guards, the other inmates, and the patterns of daily life in jail. He noticed that certain inmates got special treatment, better food, and more privileges. He noticed that some guards seemed to know things about cases before they were made public. Most importantly, He noticed that everyone seemed to know Officer Mallory's name, and none of them had anything good to say about him. "That man's been putting innocent kids in here for years," said an older inmate named William who worked in the prison library. "You ain't the first, and you probably won't be the last unless somebody stops him." Meanwhile, Sandra was having her own struggles with the system. When she tried to interview Mr. Kim about the robbery, she was told by his lawyer that he wouldn't be speaking to anyone without police approval. When she requested the security footage, she was told it had been corrupted and was unavailable. Most frustrating of all, when she tried to file a motion challenging the evidence, she found that Captain Peters had sent a memo to the prosecutor's office praising Officer Mallory's exemplary work on the case and recommending that the department's full resources be used to ensure a conviction. Sandra had seen enough corruption in her career to know that this went beyond one bad cop. Someone higher up the chain was protecting Officer Mallory, and they were willing to destroy an innocent teenager's life to do it. Late one evening, as Sandra was working in her office, she received an unexpected visitor. A young man she didn't recognize knocked on her door. "Ms. Ellis? My name is Anthony Williams. I think I have information about the Darius Holloway case." Anthony was nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder as he spoke. He told Sandra that he'd been walking past Henderson's corner store on the night of the robbery and had seen the real perpetrator running away. "It wasn't the kid they arrested," Anthony said firmly. "The guy I saw was older, maybe in his 20s, with a completely different build. Taller, heavier. Nothing like that high school student." "Anthony, this is incredible," Sandra said. "You need to testify. Your testimony could free an innocent boy." But before Anthony could respond, Sandra's phone rang. It was Anthony's mother, frantic with worry. "Anthony, where are you? Officer Mallory was just here looking for you. He said you needed to come to the station for questioning about some trouble you've been involved in." Anthony's face went white. "I haven't been involved in any trouble. He knows I saw what really happened." Sandra realized that Anthony was in real danger. "You need to be very careful," she told him. "Don't go anywhere alone, and if anyone from the police department contacts you, call me immediately." But it was too late. The next day, Anthony came to Sandra's office with a completely different story. He claimed he'd been mistaken about what he'd seen, that it was too dark to make out any details, and that he didn't want to be involved in the case anymore. Sandra could see the fear in his eyes and knew that Officer Mallory had gotten to him. Another witness intimidated into silence, another piece of evidence buried. That same week, Renee Holloway received the first threatening letter. It was simple and direct. "Stop causing problems, or your son's situation gets much worse." The letter came with a photograph, a picture of Darius in his jail cell, taken from an angle that suggested someone on the inside had taken it. The message was clear. They could get to Darius any time they wanted. Renee was terrified, but she was also angry. Her son was innocent, and she wasn't going to let anyone intimidate her into staying quiet. She took the letter to Sandra, who immediately filed a police report, but somehow the report got lost in the system, and no investigation was ever opened. As the days passed, Sandra realized she was fighting more than just a corrupt cop. She was up against an entire network of people who had a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. But she also knew that somewhere out there, someone had to have evidence that could prove Darius's innocence. What Sandra didn't know was that someone was already working behind the scenes gathering that evidence, piece by piece. The man who had sat in the back of the courtroom during Darius's first appearance was still watching, still waiting for the right moment to act. Isaiah Holloway had been tracking Officer Mallory's movements for weeks, documenting his patterns, his associates, and most importantly, his connections to other corrupt officials. Isaiah had learned patience during his years in covert operations, and he knew that moving too quickly could put his son in even greater danger. But time was running out, and soon, Isaiah would have to decide whether to continue watching from the shadows or step into the light to save his son. The choice he made would change everything. The shadowy figure who had been watching from the courthouse finally made his move on a cold Tuesday evening. Sandra Ellis was leaving her office late, exhausted from another day of hitting brick walls in Darius's case, when she noticed someone following her to the parking garage. Ms. Ellis, a deep voice called out from behind a concrete pillar. Sandra spun around, her hand instinctively reaching for the pepper spray in her purse. A tall black man stepped into the dim light, his hands raised peacefully. He looked to be in his 40s, with graying temples and intense dark eyes that seemed familiar somehow. "Who are you?" Sandra demanded, keeping her distance. The man reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a government identification card. Agent Isaiah Holloway, Central Intelligence Agency. Sandra's eyes widened as she read the name. Holloway. "You're Darius's father," Isaiah confirmed quietly. "And I need your help to save my son." Sandra stared at him in disbelief. "You're supposed to be dead, or missing. Your son thinks you abandoned him." "I know what my son thinks," Isaiah replied, pain evident in his voice. "And I know what his mother thinks too. But I never abandoned them. I've been working undercover for the past 12 years, infiltrating a domestic surveillance network that reaches into police departments, court systems, and city governments across the country. What does that have to do with Darius's case?" Isaiah stepped closer, his expression deadly serious. "Officer Mallory isn't just a corrupt cop. He's part of a private security operation that's been systematically targeting specific communities for harassment, false arrests, and intimidation. They're clearing out neighborhoods for development projects backed by government contracts." Sandra felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. "That's impossible. You're talking about a massive conspiracy." "I have proof," Isaiah said, pulling out a small flash drive. 12 years worth of evidence, communications, financial records, operational plans. But the network knows I'm closing in, and they're using my son to draw me out. Isaiah handed Sandra the flash drive, but she could see that it was partially damaged. "This contains fragments of what I've gathered. Phone calls between Mallory and his handlers, money transfers, lists of targets. But I need more time to complete the investigation." "Why come to me?" Sandra asked. "Because you're the only person involved in this case who can't be bought or intimidated," Isaiah replied. "And because if something happens to me before we can expose this network, you'll be the only one who can save Darius." Sandra looked at the flash drive in her hand. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Give me 2 weeks," Isaiah said. "Keep fighting the case through legal channels, but don't reveal what you know yet. If we move too fast, they'll either kill Darius in jail or make him disappear entirely. I need time to gather the final pieces of evidence." "And what if they come after me?" Isaiah's expression hardened. "Then you call this number immediately." He handed her a business card with only a phone number written on it. "Day or night, someone will answer." As Isaiah prepared to leave, Sandra called out to him. "Does Darius know you've been watching over him all these years?" Isaiah paused, his shoulders sagging slightly. "No, and it's better that way. The less he knows about what I really do, the safer he is." Meanwhile, Maya had convinced her friend, Derek, a tech-savvy student from Jefferson High, to help her with a dangerous plan. Derek worked part-time doing computer maintenance for local businesses, which gave him access to building security systems. "This is crazy, Maya," Derek whispered, as they approached the police station's rear entrance at 2 in the morning. "If we get caught, we're both going to jail." "Darius is innocent," Maya replied firmly, "and that pendant Officer Mallory took might have evidence that proves it." Derek had managed to loop the security cameras for exactly 10 minutes, long, enough for them to get in and out if everything went perfectly. They slipped through a maintenance door that Derek had left unlocked during his afternoon shift. The evidence storage room was in the basement, rows of metal shelves filled with boxes and bags of confiscated items. Maya used her phone's flashlight to search for anything labeled with Darius's name or case number. "Here," she whispered, finding a small plastic bag containing the silver pendant. But when Maya examined the pendant more closely, she noticed something strange. There was a tiny seam along one edge that wasn't visible unless you knew what to look for. She pressed on it gently, and a microscopic panel slid open, revealing a miniature data storage device. "Derek, look at this," Maya breathed. Derek examined the device with a small magnifying glass. "That's military-grade tech. This isn't some regular piece of jewelry." They carefully extracted the device and replaced the pendant exactly as they'd found it. Within minutes, they were back outside, their hearts pounding as they made their way to Derek's car. At Derek's house, they connected the device to his computer. What they found made Maya's blood run cold. The device contained encrypted files with code names, operational schedules, and most importantly, audio recordings of conversations between Officer Mallory and unknown individuals. In one recording, Mallory's voice was clearly audible. The Holloway kid is the perfect target. Clean record, no gang affiliations, but fits the profile we need for the operation. His arrest will generate the right kind of media coverage. And if the father surfaces? Asked another voice. Then we eliminate two problems at once. Mallory replied coldly. Maya realized that Darius's arrest wasn't random. Someone had deliberately targeted him, but she couldn't understand why. She decided to take the evidence to Sandra Ellis immediately. Back at the jail, Darius was experiencing his own revelation. He'd been thinking about his father's advice to observe everything, and he'd started noticing patterns in the way certain inmates were treated. There was a prisoner named Marcus Thompson who seemed to have unusual privileges. He received extra food, got longer recreation time, and the guards treated him with respect. When Darius finally worked up the courage to talk to Marcus, he learned something disturbing. "They got me working as an informant," Marcus admitted quietly. "I report on what other inmates say about their cases, their lawyers, anything that might be useful." "Why are you telling me this?" Darius asked. Marcus looked around nervously before answering. "Because I heard them talking about you. They want me to get close to you, find out if your family has any connections to law enforcement or government agencies." "My family?" Darius was confused. "My mom works at a grocery store. We don't know anyone in the government." "What about your father?" Darius felt a familiar ache in his chest. "I don't have a father. He left when I was little." Marcus studied Darius's face carefully. "Kid, someone thinks your family is more important than you realize, and that means you're in more danger than you know." That night, Darius lay in his narrow jail cell thinking about everything Marcus had told him. Why would anyone think his family had government connections? His mother had always been vague about his father's work, saying only that he'd been in the military and had to leave for reasons she couldn't explain. For the first time in years, Darius tried to remember more details about his father. He recalled a man who moved silently through their apartment, who always seemed to be listening for sounds that others couldn't hear. He remembered his father teaching him how to notice when someone was watching him, how to memorize faces and license plates, how to stay calm under pressure. At the time, Darius had thought these were just games they played together. Now he wondered if his father had been preparing him for something. The next morning brought devastating news that would change everything. Sandra received a call from the medical examiner's office. Anthony Williams, the witness who had seen the real perpetrator at the corner store, had been found dead in his apartment. "Apparent suicide," the medical examiner reported. Left a note saying he couldn't live with lying about what he'd seen. But when Sandra saw the note, she knew immediately that Anthony hadn't written it. The handwriting was wrong, and the language didn't match the way Anthony spoke. Someone had murdered him and made it look like suicide. Sandra called the number Isaiah had given her, and within an hour she received a text message with an address. She found herself in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where Isaiah was waiting with a laptop and several boxes of documents. "They killed Anthony," Sandra said without preamble. "I know," Isaiah replied grimly, "which means they're getting desperate. We're running out of time." Isaiah opened his laptop and showed Sandra a complex organizational chart. "This network calls itself the Domestic Security Initiative. They operate under the cover of private security contractors, but they're funded through a combination of government black budget money and private real estate development funds." "How does it work?" Sandra asked. "They identify neighborhoods that are targeted for gentrification or development," Isaiah explained. "Then they systematically arrest and harass residents, particularly young men who might become community leaders. They create a climate of fear that drives property values down and makes residents want to move away." Sandra stared at the chart in horror. And Officer Mallory? He's just a soldier in the operation. But he's good at his job, which is why they protect him. Over the past 5 years, his arrests have contributed to the displacement of over 300 families. Isaiah pulled up another file on his computer. But here's what they don't know I've discovered. The operation is about to expand. They've identified 12 more neighborhoods across the state for the same treatment. Darius's arrest was supposed to be a test case for their new methods. What new methods? Using social media and viral news coverage to create broader public support for aggressive policing, Isaiah said. They're turning police brutality into entertainment, and people are watching it like a television show. Sandra felt sick to her stomach. How do we stop this? We expose the entire network at once, Isaiah replied. But to do that, I need to get close enough to their leadership to record them admitting what they're doing. And that means taking a huge risk. What kind of risk? Isaiah closed his laptop and looked directly at Sandra. I'm going to let them capture me. It's the only way to get inside their operation and gather the evidence we need to bring them all down. That's suicide, Sandra protested. If they know who you are, they'll try to kill me, Isaiah finished. But I've been preparing for this moment for 12 years. I have contingency plans, backup evidence, and people who will act if something happens to me. What about Darius? What happens to him while you're playing spy games? Isaiah's expression softened. That's where you come in. I need you to keep fighting his case. Keep the media attention focused on the injustice of his arrest. As long as people are watching, they can't make him disappear. Sandra realized she was being asked to trust a man she'd just met with the life of her client. But she also knew that everything Isaiah had told her made sense of the strange roadblocks she'd encountered in Darius's case. If I do this, Sandra said, I need something in return. Name it. I want a way to contact your backup people directly. If something happens to you, I need to know that someone else can step in to help Darius. Isaiah nodded and handed her another card. Call this number if you don't hear from me within 72 hours. Tell them the Raven has fallen, and they'll know what to do. Judge Evelyn Monroe had been presiding over criminal cases for 15 years, and she prided herself on her ability to smell corruption from across a courtroom. When she reviewed the file for People v. Holloway, something about the case made her deeply uncomfortable. The evidence was thin. The witness statements were inconsistent, and Officer Mallory's arrest report contained several details that didn't add up. Most troubling of all, she'd received 3 separate phone calls from city officials encouraging her to expedite the case and ensure a conviction. Judge Monroe had a strict policy about outside interference in her courtroom, and she decided to take a closer look at the evidence herself. She ordered all sealed files related to Officer Mallory's previous arrests to be brought to her chambers for private review. What she found in those files made her question everything she thought she knew about the justice system. Case after case showed the same pattern. Minority teenagers arrested on serious charges, questionable evidence, witnesses who recanted their statements, and complaints against Mallory that mysteriously disappeared. This can't be legal, Judge, Monroe muttered to herself as she read through Marcus Johnson's case file. The boy had been arrested for drug possession, but the evidence chain was completely broken, and 3 different witnesses had changed their stories within days of giving their initial statements. Judge Monroe's investigation didn't go unnoticed. Within 24 hours of her request for the sealed files, she received a visit from District Attorney Robert Fleming and Captain Peters. Your Honor, D.A. Fleming said with false politeness, we understand you have some concerns about the Holloway case. I have concerns about several cases involving Officer Mallory, Judge Monroe replied coolly. The evidence patterns suggest systematic misconduct. Captain Peters leaned forward in his chair. Your Honor, with all due respect, Officer Mallory is one of our finest. He's received commendations for his work in high-crime neighborhoods. High-crime neighborhoods that seem to have gotten worse, not better after his interventions, Judge Monroe observed. D.A. Fleming shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, we feel that perhaps another judge might be better suited to handle this particular case, given the media attention and the complexity of the issues involved. Judge Monroe's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting that I recuse myself? We're suggesting that it might be in everyone's best interest, Captain Peters said. Gentlemen, Judge Monroe said firmly, I've been a judge for 15 years, and I've never been asked to recuse myself from a case unless there was a legitimate conflict of interest. Since I've never met the defendant, his family, or officer, Mallory before this case, I see no such conflict. After they left, Judge Monroe knew she was walking into dangerous territory, but she also knew that an innocent boy's life hung in the balance, and she wouldn't be intimidated into abandoning her duty. Meanwhile, Detective Lionel Quinn was having his own crisis of conscience. As a 20-year veteran of the police force, Quinn had always prided himself on being one of the good cops, but watching Officer Mallory's behavior over the past few years had made him increasingly uncomfortable. Quinn had started keeping his own informal records of Mallory's arrests, and the patterns were disturbing. Young Black and Hispanic men were being arrested at rates that seemed statistically impossible, and the charges almost always involved crimes that would generate significant media coverage. When Quinn learned that Anthony Williams had been found, dead, supposedly by suicide, he decided to investigate quietly on his own. What he found at Anthony's apartment didn't match the official police report. There were no signs of struggle, but there were also no signs that Anthony had been depressed or suicidal. His neighbors reported that he'd seemed nervous lately, but not hopeless. Most telling of all, Quinn found a draft of a letter in Anthony's computer that he'd been writing to Sandra Ellis, describing what he'd really seen at the corner store. The letter made it clear that Anthony had been prepared to testify that Darius Holloway was innocent. It also revealed that Anthony had been receiving threatening phone calls for days before his death. Quinn faced a terrible choice. He could report his findings and risk destroying his career, or he could stay silent and let an innocent kid go to prison. For Quinn, there was really no choice at all. He made copies of everything he'd found and requested a meeting with Sandra. Ellis, Ms. Ellis, Quinn said when they met at a diner outside the city. I can't officially help you, but I can tell you that Anthony Williams didn't kill himself. Sandra's pulse quickened. Do you have proof? Enough to raise serious questions, Quinn replied. But if I come forward officially, they'll destroy me and bury the evidence. The only way this works is if you can use what I give you to build a legal case that forces everything into the open. Quinn handed Sandra a thick envelope. This contains copies of my investigation into Anthony's death, plus documentation of irregularities in several of Mallory's other arrests. Use it wisely. As Sandra left the diner, she didn't notice the unmarked car that had been following her. Officer Mallory sat behind the wheel, his face twisted with rage as he watched her drive away. Mallory immediately called Captain Peters. She's got Quinn helping her now. This is getting out of hand. Calm down, Peters replied. We knew this might happen. It's time to implement the contingency plan. What contingency plan? The kid has an accident in jail. Gang violence, very tragic. The case dies with him, and everyone moves on. Mallory felt a chill run down his spine. He'd done a lot of questionable things in his career, but murder was a line he'd never crossed. Captain, we can't. We can and we will, Peters interrupted. Unless you want to explain to the FBI why you've been falsifying arrest reports for the past 5 years. That night, Sandra received an urgent call from the jail. Darius had been attacked by another inmate and was in the prison hospital with serious injuries. Sandra raced to the hospital where she found Darius conscious but badly beaten. His left arm was in a cast, and he had stitches above his right eye. What happened? Sandra asked gently. A guy named Tank Williams came at me in the shower, Darius replied weakly. Said he was sending a message from his friends on the outside. But before he could really hurt me, another inmate stepped in and stopped. Him. Who stopped him? Marcus Thompson, the guy I told you about who works as an informant. He fought Tank off and probably saved my life. Sandra realized that someone had tried to have Darius killed, but the plan had been disrupted by an unlikely hero. She also knew that they would try again. Darius, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Sandra said. I think the people who arrested you are going to try to hurt you again. From now on, you don't go anywhere alone, and you don't trust anyone except Marcus. Ms. Ellis, Darius said quietly, "There's something I need to tell you." Marcus told me that the guards have been asking questions about my father. They want to know if I've had any contact with him recently. Sandra's blood ran cold. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That I haven't seen or heard from my father since I was 5 years old. But they keep asking like they don't believe me." Sandra realized that Isaiah's cover might be blown. She needed to warn him immediately, but she also knew that any communication could put both of them in danger. As she left the hospital, Sandra made a decision that would change everything. She was going to go public with what she knew, regardless of the consequences. An innocent boy had nearly been murdered in jail, and she wasn't going to wait for it to happen again. That evening, Sandra called Maya and asked her to meet at her office. When Maya arrived, she brought Derek and the evidence they'd recovered from Darius's pendant. "I know about the recording device," Sandra said without preamble. Maya looked shocked. "How did you—" "Because Darius's father is a CIA agent who's been investigating the same corruption network that framed his son," Sandra replied. Maya sat down heavily in a chair. "Darius's father is alive?" "Very much alive and trying to save his son's life. But we're running out of time. They just tried to have Darius killed in jail, and they'll try again." Sandra outlined her plan. Maya would release the audio recordings, from the pendant to her mother's journalist contacts, creating a media firestorm that would make it impossible for anyone to harm Darius without facing intense scrutiny. "What about his father?" Maya asked. "I'm going to trust that he knows what he's doing," Sandra replied. "But if something happens to him, we'll be the only ones who can save Darius." As they finalized their plan, none of them knew that Isaiah was already putting his own desperate gambit into motion. He'd arranged to meet with the leadership of the Domestic Security Initiative, claiming he wanted to negotiate his son's freedom in exchange for his silence about their operations. It was a lie, of course. Isaiah had no intention of staying silent, but he needed to get close enough to record their admissions of guilt, even if it meant risking his own life in the process. The meeting was set for the following night at an abandoned construction site outside the city. Isaiah checked his recording equipment one final time and prepared for what might be his final operation. In 12 hours, everything would change forever. The morning of the hearing arrived with an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air around the courthouse. By 8 o'clock, protesters had already gathered outside, their signs demanding justice for Darius Holloway. News vans lined the street, and reporters interviewed anyone willing to speak about the case that had become a symbol of systemic injustice. Sandra Ellis arrived early, her briefcase heavy with evidence that could change everything. She'd barely slept the night before, knowing that today would determine whether an innocent boy went free or spent the best years of his life in prison. As she walked through the crowd of protesters, she heard chants of "Free Darius" and "Justice Now" echoing off the courthouse walls. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Maya sat in the front row with her mother, both of them clutching copies of the explosive story they'd published online at midnight. The recordings from Darius's pendant had already been downloaded over 50,000 times, and social media was buzzing with outrage over Officer Mallory's recorded admissions. Officer Mallory strutted into the courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock, his chest puffed out with the same arrogance he'd displayed throughout the case. He nodded confidently to D.A. Fleming and took his seat at the prosecution table, apparently unconcerned about the media storm swirling around him. Captain Peters sat in the gallery, his jaw clenched tight as he surveyed the packed courtroom. He'd seen the news reports and knew that their carefully constructed case was falling apart. But he also knew they had one more card to play, and he was prepared to use it. At 9:15, Darius was led into the courtroom in handcuffs, his arm still in a cast from the jail attack. Despite everything he'd been through, he walked with his head held high, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Maya. She gave him an encouraging nod, and for the first time in weeks, Darius almost smiled. Then something extraordinary happened. As Darius settled into his seat at the defendant's table, the courtroom doors opened one final time. A tall black man in a perfectly tailored dark suit walked in, his movement so quiet and controlled that he seemed to glide across the floor. Darius turned to see who had entered, and his entire world stopped. The man was older than he remembered, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of years of stress and danger. But there was no mistaking those features that way, of moving through space like he owned it. "Dad?" Darius whispered, his voice barely audible. Isaiah Holloway met his son's eyes across the courtroom, and 12 years of separation dissolved in an instant. Isaiah's carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly, revealing the pain and love he'd carried for so long. The courtroom erupted in whispers as people recognized that something significant was happening. Reporters frantically scribbled notes, and Officer Mallory's confident expression began to waver as he studied the mysterious newcomer. Judge Monroe called for order, and the hearing began. D.A. Fleming stood to present the state's case, but Sandra immediately rose to interrupt. "Your Honor," Sandra said firmly, "before the prosecution proceeds, the defense moves to dismiss all charges based on newly discovered evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption." The courtroom buzzed with excitement as Sandra approached the bench with a thick folder of documents. "Your Honor, we have evidence that Officer Mallory systematically falsified arrest reports, intimidated witnesses, and planted evidence in multiple cases, including this one." D. Fleming shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to distract from the clear evidence of the defendant's guilt." "I'll hear the motion," Judge Monroe said calmly. "Ms. Ellis, present your evidence." Sandra returned to her table and nodded to Isaiah, who stood slowly and walked to the witness stand. The courtroom fell completely silent as he raised his right hand to be sworn in. "State your name for the record," the court clerk said. "Agent Isaiah Holloway, Central Intelligence Agency," he replied in a clear, strong voice. The courtroom exploded. Reporters shouted questions, protesters cheered, and Judge Monroe had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order. Officer Mallory's face had gone completely white, and he was whispering urgently to Captain Peters. "Agent Holloway," Sandra began when the chaos finally subsided. "What is your relationship to the defendant?" "Darius Holloway is my son," Isaiah replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And where have you been for the past 12 years? Isaiah straightened in his chair. "I've been conducting a covert investigation into a domestic surveillance and harassment network that has been systematically targeting minority communities across multiple states." D.A. Fleming objected loudly, but Judge Monroe overruled him. She was as riveted by Isaiah's testimony as everyone else in the courtroom. "Agent Holloway," Sandra continued, "does this network include members of law enforcement?" "Yes, including Officer Brent Mallory, who has been acting as a field operative for an organization called the Domestic Security Initiative." Officer Mallory jumped to his feet. "This is ridiculous. I don't know what he's talking about." "Sit down." "Officer Mallory," Judge Monroe ordered sharply. Isaiah looked directly at Mallory as he continued. 3 days ago, I attended a meeting with the leadership of this organization. They believed I was negotiating my silence in exchange for my son's freedom. Instead, I recorded everything they said. Sandra activated a portable speaker system and played a crystal-clear recording of voices discussing the operation to frame Darius. "The Holloway arrest was perfect," said an unidentified voice. "Clean kid, no record, maximum media impact. Mallory executed it flawlessly." "What about the father?" asked another voice. "If he surfaces, we eliminate him. The kid too, if necessary. We can't let this operation be exposed." The courtroom was dead silent as the recording continued, detailing plans to expand their operations to other cities and the millions of dollars in development contracts that would follow. When the recording ended, Judge Monroe called for an immediate recess. As the courtroom cleared, Darius was allowed a brief moment with his father. "I thought you were dead," Darius said, tears streaming down his face. "I wanted to come back so many times," Isaiah replied, his own voice breaking. "But I knew that, if I did, they would use you to get to me. I never stopped watching over you, son, never." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because the less you knew, the safer you were. But when they arrested you, I knew I had to finish this once and for all." Back in chambers, Judge Monroe was meeting with attorneys from both sides. D.A. Fleming was frantically trying to salvage his case, while Captain Peters made increasingly desperate phone calls to his superiors. "Your Honor," D.A. Fleming argued. Even if these allegations about Officer Mallory are true, we still have video evidence of the defendant committing the crime. What video evidence? Sandra asked. You've never produced any video evidence. The convenience store security footage clearly shows... Shows what? Sandra interrupted. The footage was conveniently corrupted, remember? And the store owner has been too intimidated to testify honestly. Judge Monroe looked at D.A. Fleming with barely concealed disgust. Counselor, are you telling me that you've been prosecuting this case based on evidence that doesn't exist? Before D.A. Fleming could answer, his phone rang. After a brief, heated conversation, he hung up with a defeated expression. Your Honor, he said quietly, the district attorney's office is withdrawing all charges against the defendant, but their victory was short-lived. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Captain Peters approached Isaiah with a cold smile. Agent Holloway, Peters said loudly enough for nearby reporters to hear. I hope you realize what you've done. You've destroyed the career of one of our finest officers based on fabricated evidence. The only thing I've destroyed, Isaiah replied evenly, is a criminal conspiracy. We'll see about that, Peters said ominously. This isn't over. That evening, while the Holloway family was finally reunited at home, Isaiah's former CIA handler, Director Sarah Mitchell, was reviewing the complete files from his 12-year investigation. What she found in those documents would reshape the entire case. Mitchell had initially been skeptical of Isaiah's claims about widespread domestic corruption, but the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed millions of dollars flowing, from development companies to private security firms, which then funneled money to corrupt police officers and city officials. The next morning, Mitchell appeared at Judge Monroe's courtroom with a team of federal agents and a stack of warrants. She introduced herself as a witness who could provide crucial context for the evidence already presented. Your Honor, Director Mitchell testified, Agent Holloway's investigation has uncovered a network of corruption that extends far beyond this local case. We have evidence of similar operations in 11 different cities, all coordinated by the same criminal organization. She presented a detailed organizational chart showing how the Domestic Security Initiative recruited corrupt law enforcement officers to target specific communities for harassment and false arrests. The goal, Mitchell explained, was to destabilize these neighborhoods so that property values would drop, making it easier for connected developers to acquire land for government-backed construction projects. Judge Monroe studied the chart with growing horror. How many people have been falsely arrested? Our preliminary count shows over 800 cases across all cities, Mitchell replied. Many of the victims are still in prison. A new witness was then called to the stand. Derek Lyle, a former security contractor who had worked directly with Officer Mallory. Lyle had been found by Isaiah's investigation team and agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. Mr. Lyle, Sandra questioned, what was your role in this organization? I was a coordinator, Lyle admitted nervously. My job was to identify targets and provide intelligence to field operatives like Mallory. How were targets selected? We looked for young men in specific neighborhoods who could be portrayed as dangerous criminals. Honor students were actually preferred because their arrests generated more media coverage. Was Darius Holloway specifically targeted? Yes. His profile was perfect. Smart kid, clean record, lived in a neighborhood we needed to destabilize. Plus, we knew his father was intelligence, so arresting him might draw Isaiah out of hiding. The revelation that Darius had been targeted specifically because of his father's work sent shockwaves through the courtroom. It wasn't just a case of police misconduct. It was a deliberate attack on a CIA operative's family. When it was time for Darius to speak, he walked to the witness stand with a quiet dignity that impressed everyone present. Despite everything he'd endured, his voice was steady and clear. Your Honor, Darius began. I want people to understand what it's like to be a 17-year-old black kid who's been told his whole life that if he just works hard and stays out of trouble, he'll be okay. I believe that. I thought if I got good grades and followed the rules, I'd be safe. He paused, looking directly at Officer Mallory. But I learned that none of that matters to people who have already decided what story they want to tell about you. They don't care about who you really are or what you've actually done. They just care about what you represent to them. Darius's voice grew stronger as he continued. I'm not angry about what happened to me. I'm angry about all the kids who didn't have a father who could save them, who didn't have a lawyer who believed them, who didn't have friends willing to risk everything to help them. How many of them are sitting in jail right now for crimes they didn't commit? The courtroom was completely silent as Darius finished his statement. Even hardened reporters were wiping away tears. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Officer Mallory was called to testify in his own defense. As Sandra began her cross-examination, Mallory's carefully constructed facade finally began to crack. Officer Mallory, Sandra said calmly, how many minority teenagers have you arrested in the past 5 years? I don't keep count by race, Mallory replied defensively. According to department records, you've arrested 47 Black or Hispanic teenagers in the past 5 years. How many white teenagers have you arrested in that same period? Mallory's lawyer objected, but Judge Monroe allowed the question. I arrest criminals regardless of their race, Mallory said through gritted teeth. Yet somehow, 93% of the teenagers you arrest happen to be minorities. Would you say that's just a coincidence? Crime happens where crime happens, Mallory replied, his voice rising. Sandra played another recording from Isaiah's investigation, this one featuring Mallory's voice clearly stating his intention to clean up these neighborhoods by putting the troublemakers where they belong. Officer Mallory, Sandra continued relentlessly, on this recording, you referred to teenage honor students as troublemakers. Can you explain that? Mallory's composure finally shattered completely. You want to know the truth? He shouted, jumping to his feet. These kids are all potential criminals anyway. I'm just stopping them before they can hurt innocent people. The courtroom erupted as Mallory continued his racist rant, revealing the hatred that had motivated his actions all along. Judge Monroe called for order, but the damage was done. Mallory had destroyed any remaining credibility he might have had. As the hearing continued, more evidence emerged about the broader conspiracy. Phone records showed Captain Peters had been in regular contact with development company executives. Financial records revealed that several city council members had received payments from the same companies that funded the Domestic Security Initiative. The corruption ran so deep that Judge Monroe realized the entire case needed to be turned over to federal authorities. She declared a mistrial and ordered all charges against Darius dismissed immediately. But the victory came with a price. That evening, as the Holloway family celebrated at home, Isaiah received a call from Director Mitchell. Isaiah, you need to get your family somewhere safe, she said urgently. We've intercepted communications suggesting they're planning to eliminate all witnesses. What kind of communications? The kind that means this network is more desperate and dangerous than we thought. They're not going to let this investigation destroy them without a fight. Isaiah looked at his son and wife, finally reunited after 12 years apart, and realized that their fight for justice was far from over. The conspiracy they'd exposed was wounded but not dead, and wounded animals were often the most dangerous of all. Outside their house, unmarked cars had begun to circle the neighborhood. The shadows were moving again, and Isaiah knew that the final confrontation was still to come. As news of the day's revelation spread across the country, other victims of the Domestic Security Initiative began to come forward. Families who had lost sons to false arrests, communities that had been systematically targeted, and honest police officers who had been silenced for trying to speak out. The case of Darius Holloway had become something much larger than anyone had anticipated. It was no longer just about one corrupt cop or one innocent teenager. It was about the soul of the justice system itself, and whether truth could triumph over power when everything was on the line. The Holloway family's homecoming was unlike anything Darius had ever imagined. After weeks of sterile jail cells and courthouse proceedings, walking through the front door of his childhood home felt surreal. The living room looked exactly the same. The worn brown couch where he used to do homework, the family photos on the mantel, his mother's collection of books stacked neatly on the coffee table. Renee couldn't stop touching her son, as if she needed to prove to herself that he was really there. She kept reaching over to smooth his hair or squeeze his hand, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. I knew you'd come home, she whispered, pulling both Darius and Isaiah into a fierce embrace. I never stopped believing. Isaiah stood awkwardly at first, 12 years of separation creating an invisible barrier between him and his family. But when Renee reached for him, he melted into the embrace, and for a moment, they were just a family again. Maya arrived an hour later with a camera crew from her mother's news station. The footage of the reunion, Darius laughing with his best friend while his parents watched with grateful smiles, went viral within hours. The image became a symbol of hope, proof that sometimes the system could be forced to work correctly. How does it feel to be free? Maya asked Darius as they sat on his front porch, the camera rolling. It feels like waking up from a nightmare, Darius replied thoughtfully. But I keep thinking about all the kids who are still trapped in that nightmare, kids who don't have what I had. What did you have that they don't? A father who could save me, Darius said simply. A lawyer who believed me. A best friend who refused to give up. Most kids don't get that lucky. Meanwhile, Officer Brent Mallory was experiencing his own reckoning. 3 days after his courtroom breakdown, he found himself in federal custody, facing charges that would put him away for the rest of his life. The arrogant swagger that had defined his career was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who had lost everything. His sentencing hearing was held in the same courthouse where he had once strutted around like a king. This time, he entered, in shackles, his orange jumpsuit a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. Judge Monroe, who had requested to preside over the sentencing, looked down at Mallory with cold satisfaction. "Mr. Mallory," she began, "in my 15 years on the bench I have never seen a more systematic abuse of power or a more callous disregard for human dignity. You took an oath to serve and protect, and instead you chose to terrorize and destroy." The courtroom was packed with victims of Mallory's corruption, teenagers who had been falsely arrested, families who had been torn apart, community members whose lives had been disrupted by his actions. "Your actions," Judge Monroe continued, "represent everything that is wrong with policing in America. You saw young Black and Hispanic men not as fellow human beings, but as targets to be eliminated. You used your badge as a weapon of oppression." Mallory's lawyer had advised him to show remorse, to apologize to his victims and their families. But even facing 30 years in prison, Mallory's hatred ran too deep. "I was doing my job," he said defiantly when given the chance to speak. "I was protecting this community from criminals and thugs." Judge Monroe's expression hardened. "Mr. Mallory, you have shown no remorse, no understanding of the pain you have caused, and no recognition of your crimes. Therefore, I sentence you to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." As Mallory was led away, many in the courtroom applauded. But Darius, who had attended the sentencing, felt no satisfaction. Putting one corrupt cop in prison wouldn't fix the system that had created him. The ripple effects of the scandal spread far beyond Officer Mallory. Within weeks, investigations were launched in 11 different cities where the Domestic Security Initiative had operated. Federal agents raided police stations, seized financial records, and arrested dozens of officials who had participated in the conspiracy. Captain Peters was among the first to be arrested. Unlike Mallory, Peters tried to cooperate with investigators, hoping to reduce his sentence by providing information about the network's operations. But the damage to his career and reputation was irreversible. District Attorney Robert Fleming resigned in disgrace after it was revealed that his office had suppressed evidence in multiple cases connected to the conspiracy. In his resignation letter, he offered a hollow apology to the victims, claiming he had been misled by corrupt officers. "I deeply regret any role I may have played in these injustices," Fleming wrote, but his words rang empty to the families, whose lives had been destroyed by his office's willingness to look the other way. Maya's journalism career took off like a rocket. The scholarship offers poured in from universities across the country, but she chose to stay local, accepting a position with a national news organization that would allow her to continue investigating corruption. "I realized something during this whole experience," Maya told her mother. "There are stories like Darius's happening every day, in every city. Someone needs to tell those stories." Her first major investigation focused on the hundreds of cases that were being reviewed as a result of the Domestic Security Initiative scandal. She traveled to different cities, interviewing families who had been torn apart by false arrests, and documenting the human cost of the conspiracy. Sandra Ellis received an offer to head a new civil rights task force, a federal initiative designed to investigate and prosecute police corruption. At first she hesitated, unsure if she wanted to leave her work as a public defender. "I've always been a defense attorney," she told Isaiah during one of their meetings. "I fight for individual clients, not abstract concepts like justice." "But now you have the chance to fight for hundreds of clients at once," Isaiah replied. "All those kids who are still sitting in jail for crimes they didn't commit, they need someone like you." Sandra eventually accepted the position, but she made one condition. Her first priority would be reviewing every case connected to the Domestic Security Initiative and working to free the innocent victims. Isaiah faced his own difficult decision. The CIA offered him a new assignment, a chance to investigate similar corruption networks in other countries. The work was important, and it would use all the skills he had developed over his years undercover, but it would also mean leaving his family again, just when they had been reunited. "Go," Darius told his father when Isaiah explained the situation. "Finish what you started. There are other kids out there who need someone to fight for them, just like you fought for me." "I don't want to lose you again," Isaiah said, his voice thick with emotion. "You won't lose me," Darius replied firmly. "I understand now why you had to leave before, and I understand why you need to go again. Just promise me you'll come back when the job is done." Isaiah pulled his son into a tight embrace. "I promise." Before leaving, Isaiah gave Darius the original pendant back, along with something new. A laptop computer with secure communication software that would allow them to stay in touch safely. "Use this to keep learning," Isaiah said, "and use what you learn to help other people." Darius threw himself into his studies with renewed passion. He was accepted into the prestigious MIT summer program for advanced computer science, but he also enrolled in courses on criminal justice and constitutional law. He had found his calling, using technology to fight injustice. "I want to build systems that make it harder for corrupt cops to hide their crimes," Darius explained to a reporter. "I want to create tools that help defense attorneys find the truth and protect innocent people." A memorial service was held for Anthony Williams and the other victims who had died as a result of the conspiracy. Darius spoke at the service, dedicating it to all the young men whose voices had been silenced. "Anthony died because he was brave enough to tell the truth," Darius said. "He saw an innocent person being framed, and he was willing to risk everything to speak up. That's the kind of courage we need more of in this world." The service was attended by hundreds of people, including many of the police officers who had worked to expose the corruption. Detective Quinn, who had provided crucial evidence that helped bring down the conspiracy, served as one of the pallbearers. 6 months after his release, Darius found a letter waiting for him when he came home from school. It was from his father, written before Isaiah had left for his new assignment. "My son," the letter began, "I want you to know that watching you grow into the man you've become has been the greatest privilege of my life. You faced the worst that this world had to offer, and you never lost your dignity, your hope, or your compassion. I spent 12 years trying to protect you from a distance, thinking that was the only way to keep you safe. But you didn't need my protection. You needed my presence. I hope that someday I can make up for those lost years. You are stronger than I ever was, braver than I ever dreamed of being, and more hopeful than I have any right to expect. Use that strength, that bravery, and that hope to change the world. I know you will." Darius kept the letter in the restored pendant, reading it whenever he needed strength. 1 year after Officer Mallory's conviction, the city looked dramatically different. A new police chief, Maria Rodriguez, had implemented sweeping reforms designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had flourished under the previous administration. Body cameras were mandatory, civilian oversight boards had real power, and officers were required to undergo regular training on racial bias and constitutional rights. "We're not just changing policies," Chief Rodriguez explained to a packed town hall meeting. "We're changing the culture of policing. We're making it Clear that officers who abuse their power will face consequences, and officers who speak up about corruption will be protected. Detective Quinn had been promoted to lead the new Internal Affairs Unit, specifically tasked with investigating complaints against officers. His first case involved an officer who had been caught on video using excessive force during a traffic stop. Unlike the old days, the investigation was swift and thorough, and the officer was fired within a week. "This is what accountability looks like," Quinn told reporters. "No more covering up for bad cops, no more protecting officers who break the law." Darius had launched his organization, the Holloway Initiative, from his dorm room at MIT using the programming skills he'd developed and the legal knowledge he was acquiring. He created a platform that helped defense attorneys access police misconduct records, track patterns of abuse, and connect with expert witnesses. The platform had already been used in over 200 cases across the country, helping to expose corrupt officers and free wrongly convicted individuals. "Technology isn't neutral," Darius explained in a TED Talk that was viewed over 1 million times. "It can be used to oppress people or to liberate them. I choose liberation." Maya had become one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country, her work focusing on criminal justice reform and police accountability. Her documentary about the Domestic Security Initiative scandal had won several awards and sparked investigations in cities across the nation. The story didn't. And when Darius was freed, Maya said during an interview, that was just the beginning. Real change happens when people stay engaged, when they refuse to let the system go back to the way it was. Renee had found her own calling in community activism. She now ran support groups for mothers whose children had been wrongly accused or imprisoned, providing both emotional support and practical guidance on navigating the legal system. "I know what it feels like to watch your child disappear into a system that doesn't care about the truth," Renee told a group of mothers at one of her meetings. "But I also know that if we stick together, if we refuse to give up, we can change that system." Sandra's Civil Rights Task Force had reviewed over 800 cases connected to the Domestic Security Initiative. So far, they had secured the release of 127 wrongly convicted individuals and had identified patterns of corruption in dozens of police departments. "Justice delayed is justice denied," Sandra said during a press conference, announcing the latest round of releases. "These young men lost years of their lives because of a system that valued convictions over truth. We can't give them back those years, but we can make sure this never happens again." The task force was also working on federal legislation that would make it easier to prosecute police misconduct and would provide compensation for victims of wrongful prosecution. But the most significant change was in the communities that had been targeted by the conspiracy. Where once there had been fear and mistrust, there was now engagement and hope. Community members were attending city council meetings, participating in police oversight boards, and demanding accountability from their elected officials. A new case arrived on Sandra's desk that felt disturbingly familiar. A 17-year-old black student named Marcus Williams had been arrested in Denver for a robbery he claimed he didn't commit. The arresting officer had a history of targeting minority youth, and several witnesses had mysteriously changed their stories. Sandra opened the thick file and began reading through the police reports. The patterns were there, the questionable evidence, the intimidated witnesses, the rush to judgment. It was like looking at Darius's case all over again. "Here we go again," Sandra muttered to herself as she reached for her phone to call her team. But this time would be different. This time they had the tools, the experience, and the network of allies needed to fight back from the beginning. The system that had failed Darius wouldn't fail Marcus. Darius was in his computer lab at MIT when he received Sandra's call about the new case. Without hesitation, he began pulling data on the Denver Police Department, looking for patterns of misconduct and identifying potential witnesses who might have been overlooked. "The algorithms are showing clear bias in this officer's arrest patterns," Darius told Sandra during their video call. "I'm sending you everything I found." 6 months later, Marcus Williams walked free, the charges against him dismissed after evidence of police misconduct was uncovered. Unlike Darius, Marcus didn't have to spend months in jail waiting for justice. The system was learning, slowly but surely, to police itself. On the second anniversary of his arrest, Darius visited the unmarked grave of a young man named Jerome Patterson, who had died in prison while serving time for a crime he didn't commit. One of Mallory's earlier victims, who had never gotten justice. Darius knelt beside the simple gravestone and placed his father's pendant on the ground. "I promise we won't forget you," he said quietly. "And we won't let this happen to anyone else." A few days later, Darius received an unexpected call. Isaiah was finally coming home, his overseas assignment complete. The corruption network they had exposed in the United States had connections around the world, and Isaiah had spent 2 years helping to dismantle those connections. "It's over," Isaiah told his son over their secure video link. "Really over this time." The reunion at the airport was everything Darius had dreamed of during those dark days in jail. His father stepped off the plane, looking older and more tired than before, but his eyes were bright with the knowledge that his mission was finally complete. "You did it, Dad," Darius said as they embraced. "You actually did it." "We did it," Isaiah corrected. "All of us together." That evening, the family gathered for dinner in their old kitchen. Renee had made Isaiah's favorite meal, and Maya joined them with her latest article about police reform efforts spreading to other countries. "What's next?" Maya asked as they sat around the table. "College for you," Renee said, looking at Darius with pride. "And whatever comes after that." "Law school, probably," Darius replied. "I want to combine technology and law to keep fighting for justice." "And I'll be there to help," Isaiah said, reaching across the table to squeeze his son's hand. 3 years later, Darius stood before a new group of high school students, speaking at their graduation ceremony. He was now a senior at MIT, headed to law school in the fall, and his organization had helped free over 500 wrongly convicted individuals. "They tried to bury us," Darius said, looking out at the young faces in the audience. "They tried to convince the world that we were dangerous, that we didn't deserve justice, that our lives didn't matter." He paused, thinking of all the young people who were sitting in jail cells at that very moment, waiting for someone to believe in their innocence. "But we weren't buried," Darius continued, his voice growing stronger. "We were planted. And now, we're growing into something they never expected. A generation that refuses to accept injustice, that demands better from our institutions, and that will never stop fighting for the truth." The audience erupted in applause, but Darius was already thinking about the work that lay ahead. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and every step forward made the next step possible. As he left the stage, Darius touched the pendant around his neck, feeling the weight of his father's sacrifice and the responsibility that came with his freedom. He had been given a second chance, and he intended to use it to give that same chance to others. The story of Darius Holloway had become more than just one boy's fight for justice. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people refused to give up, when they stood together against corruption, and when they believed that the truth was stronger than any lie. And in courtrooms and police stations and community centers across the country, that belief was changing everything. How many innocent lives are destroyed while we scroll past the headlines, and how many corrupt systems continue to thrive because we choose silence over action? If this story opened your eyes to the fight for justice that's happening right now, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that matter.